Every convincing fake needs one thing. Nobody stops to question it. For decades, purists praised curvy coupes from Turin and dismissed anything made in Germany. Then a small workshop in Osnabrück built that exact curve, wrapped it around parts everyone already owned, and watched those critics fall for it. The Karmann Ghia wasn't Italian at all. It barely qualified as a sports car either. Underneath, it was a Beetle wearing a disguise so sharp that Volkswagen's own leadership almost said no to it. Picture this machine parked beside a Ferrari in 1955. Could you have spotted the difference? Drop your guess below. Wilhelm Karmann had built car bodies his whole career, and none of them carried his name into history. His firm in Osnabrück handled convertible tops and custom coachwork for other manufacturers. Steady work, respectable work, the kind that paid bills without ever making headlines. By the early 1950s, that quiet respectability had started to bother him. Volkswagen's factory sat close enough that Karmann could watch Beetles roll out by the thousands. Plain, reliable, utterly without glamour. He wanted to build something people would stop and stare at. Not a truck, not a family sedan. A shape that belonged on a boulevard in Nice, not a factory floor in Wolfsburg. Turin held the answer, or at least the people who could draw it. Karmann reached out to Ghia, the Italian design house already known for shaping bodies for Chrysler and other American clients chasing European flair. Luigi Segre ran the studio, and Segre had something sitting half-finished in his workshop already. A sleek prototype originally sketched for an entirely different customer. Its lines borrowed loosely from American concept work but refined into something unmistakably continental. Segre's team adapted that shape to fit a Beetle floor pan, low doors, a sloping hood, fenders that curved instead of squaring off. None of it matched anything rolling off Volkswagen's own assembly line, and that mismatch was exactly the point. Karmann traveled there himself to see the progress. He ran his palm along panels still rough from shaping, listening to craftsmen argue in a language he barely spoke. The dispute centered on one curve near the rear haunch that still wasn't sitting right. One finished prototype eventually made the trip back to Germany, and that trip mattered more than anything built inside the workshop. Karmann needed Volkswagen's approval before this car could ever reach a customer, and Volkswagen meant one man specifically, Heinz Nordhoff, the company's chief executive, a former aircraft engineer who ran Wolfsburg with the discipline of someone still answering to a military chain of command. Nordhoff had spent years building Volkswagen's reputation around a single idea: utility, reliability. A car for a family that needed transportation, not a car for someone chasing attention on a coastal road. Sports coupes struck him as indulgence, exactly the kind of distraction a serious manufacturer couldn't afford while still rebuilding from a devastated post-war economy. Rumors inside the company suggested Nordhoff hadn't even agreed to see the prototype at first. Karmann pushed anyway, arranging a private viewing rather than a formal pitch, betting that the shape itself might argue a case no memo ever could. The car arrived at Wolfsburg on a gray afternoon, parked outside the administration building where Nordhoff's office windows looked down onto the courtyard. Workers on their lunch break noticed it first, drifting closer in twos and threes, murmuring about the curves, the low stance, the way sunlight moved differently across hand-formed steel than it did across anything stamped by machine. Nordhoff stepped outside eventually, according to accounts later shared by people who worked under him. He circled the car twice without speaking. Silence stretched long enough that Karmann's own nerves started fraying, certain he'd wasted a fortune chasing a fantasy Wolfsburg would never approve. Then Nordhoff asked a single question, quiet enough that only the men standing closest actually heard it. Not about cost, not about production timelines. He wanted to know how fast this car could reach American showrooms. That question changed everything, though nobody in the courtyard understood how much resistance still stood between a prototype and a production line. Board members inside Volkswagen reacted with far less enthusiasm than their chief executive had. Reports from internal meetings described genuine skepticism about diverting factory resources toward a low-volume coupe when Beetle demand alone kept every assembly line running at capacity. Manufacturing capacity was scarce. Steel allocations were tight. Spending either on a car built mainly to look attractive struck several executives as a luxury the company hadn't earned yet. Skeptics raised a specific worry, one that came up repeatedly according to later interviews with engineers who sat through those debates. Would this car dilute the brand Nordhoff had spent a decade building? Volkswagen's entire identity rested on dependability, not style. A flashy coupe risked making the company look frivolous exactly when serious European manufacturers were fighting for post-war credibility. Karmann faced pressure from a different direction entirely. His own firm had sunk real money into the Turin prototype, and every month of institutional hesitation ate further into a budget his business couldn't sustain indefinitely. He wasn't just pitching a design anymore. He was defending an investment that could sink his company if Wolfsburg walked away. Segre, watching from Italy, pushed just as hard from his side of the partnership. Ghia's reputation depended on this deal reaching production too, proof that an Italian design house could shape volume manufacturing for a serious European automaker rather than one-off show cars nobody could actually buy. If you like discovering how close beloved cars came to never existing, stick around. The next turn is where everything almost fell apart. Nordhoff, according to accounts from that period, made the case internally using numbers rather than passion. Export markets mattered more to Volkswagen's survival than domestic sentiment did, and America in particular represented exactly the kind of growth the company desperately needed. A stylish, affordable coupe built on parts Volkswagen already manufactured by the hundreds of thousands wouldn't require new tooling or new engineering. It would require confidence and little else. That argument slowly won over enough resistance to move forward. Approval came through in stages rather than one dramatic announcement. Tooling contracts signed quietly, production timelines drafted without the fanfare that usually surrounded a new Volkswagen model. Wolfsburg treated this project almost like a controlled experiment rather than a flagship launch. Production itself split unusually between two countries, an arrangement almost unheard of for a mainstream manufacturer at the time. Bodies were still hand-formed in Turin under Ghia's supervision, then shipped to Karmann's own factory in Osnabrück for final assembly onto Volkswagen mechanicals. Every single car crossed an international border mid-build before reaching a single customer. Engineers who worked the assembly process later described genuine pride in that unusual arrangement, a small rebellion against how efficiently modern manufacturing usually demanded everything happen under one roof. Craftsmanship mattered more here than speed, and everyone involved in the process seemed to understand that trade-off going in. By late 1955, finished cars were ready for public unveiling, and Wolfsburg's marketing department faced a genuinely unusual problem. Nothing about their standard playbook applied to this car. It wasn't a family sedan. It wasn't built for buyers comparing horsepower figures against rival sports cars either. Whoever they aimed this campaign at, it would need to be someone nobody in Detroit or Turin had bothered courting yet. Detroit's sports car campaigns in the mid-1950s followed a predictable script, aimed almost entirely at one buyer, a man chasing status, horsepower, and bragging rights over his neighbor's sedan. Corvette ads leaned hard into speed. Thunderbird ads leaned into masculine glamour. Every major manufacturer competing in this segment assumed the customer sitting behind the wheel would be exactly that customer and nothing else. Volkswagen's marketing team looked at that landscape and made a decision nobody else in the industry seemed willing to make. Rather than competing directly against Corvette owners on power and prestige, they aimed the Karmann Ghia at buyers those campaigns ignored completely: first-time car owners, younger drivers without deep pockets, and notably, women. American advertising from the period shows this shift plainly, once you know to look for it. Early Karmann Ghia print ads showed women driving the car alone, confident and unaccompanied. That was a rare choice. Most automotive advertising of the era cast women as passengers, not owners, behind the wheel. Copy emphasized ease of use, manageable size, and low running costs rather than raw performance figures competitors were busy printing in bold type. This wasn't accidental positioning. Internal Volkswagen of America correspondence from later in the decade describes deliberate targeting research identifying an underserved buyer, someone who wanted a car that looked genuinely special without demanding either a large budget or serious mechanical confidence. Beetle mechanics underneath meant reliability nobody needed to worry about, the exact opposite of the temperamental European sports cars competing for the same showroom attention. Sales figures validated the strategy almost immediately. Where established rivals often struggled outside a narrow enthusiast market, the Karmann Ghia found buyers across a demographic nobody else had bothered mapping out. College students saved for one. Young professionals bought one as their first real car instead of a hand-me-down sedan. Women, largely overlooked by an industry still designing almost exclusively around male customers, found a car whose marketing didn't quietly assume someone else was making the purchasing decision for them. Consider what that decision actually required. Every major competitor treated performance as the entire conversation. Engine displacement and top speed printed prominently across every advertisement, fighting for the same customer's attention. Volkswagen ignored that conversation almost entirely, betting instead that style alone, paired with dependability nobody needed to question, could win a completely different kind of buyer. That bet paid off for nearly 2 decades. The Karmann Ghia stayed in production from 1955 until 1974, an unusually long run for a car built on borrowed mechanicals and modest performance figures that never once impressed enthusiast magazines chasing horsepower headlines. Nearly 500,000 examples eventually left Karmann's factory floor, remarkable output for a coupe most critics dismissed as underpowered the moment reviews started circulating. Here's the detail most retrospectives quietly skip past. Critics judging the car purely on numbers missed the entire point of why it existed. Sluggish acceleration and modest top speed didn't matter to a buyer who'd never been the target of a horsepower war in the first place. Volkswagen wasn't trying to win that argument. They'd built something for people the rest of the industry had spent years overlooking completely. Karmann's original gamble, the one that nearly stalled inside a skeptical boardroom before a single customer ever saw it, ended up outlasting almost every rival it was never actually designed to beat. That first prototype, the one Nordhoff circled twice in silence, still exists today, restored and quietly on display in Germany. Nobody at Wolfsburg expected a coupe built for overlooked buyers to outlast its own decade. So tell us, which forgotten Volkswagen deserves its story told next? Drop your pick below, then subscribe.